Tonight I was talking about the topic of my new book, which is called 0 Degrees of Empathy, and it's looking at what the nature of empathy is, and also what are the different ways that you can lose your empathy.
So what is empathy, I guess, firstly?
Well, I defined empathy as the drive to recognise or identify what someone else is thinking or feeling. But a second part of it is also responding with an appropriate emotion to someone else's thoughts and feelings.
And there are actually titles for each of these terms for each of these types of empathy.
Well, psychologists call the first part cognitive empathy, so that's the recognition element, and they call the second part the affective component, which is the response, the emotional response.
And how do you look into then empathy in the population? What do you look at?
There are different ways that you can look at empathy in the population. You can use psychological measures like questionnaires or tests of emotion recognition, showing people videos or photographs of facial expressions, for example, and getting them to judge what the person might feel. You can use brain scanning to see which parts of the brain are involved when you're trying to empathise. And ultimately you can look at what correlates with your score on an empathy test. So you can look at early experience or indeed parts of biology.
And with regard to then empathy in the population, how is it figured? Where do people scale on this, and how do you know how empathetic somebody is?
Well, for convenience, we break down the range of scores on an empathy questionnaire just to 6 degrees of empathy, where 0 means you're absolutely at the lowest level, and 6 is the maximum. Most of us score somewhere in the middle, so it's a bell curve. It looks like a normal distribution, but on different measures, you have to standardise the scores, but you do see this range of individual differences. So that's just telling us that you don't either have empathy or not have it. It's not a binary thing. It's a quantitative thing.
And what do we know about the factors affecting how empathetic somebody is?
Well, we know that your early experience contributes to how much empathy you end up with. Because if you study children who've been abused or who suffered neglect, they tend to grow up with not just social difficulties, but difficulties judging what other people are feeling. And often they can be quite prone to misinterpreting other people's actions. So someone who was actually trying to be friendly might be interpreted as being hostile or aggressive. So they misunderstand the cues. Their empathy has been affected, presumably because of their early experience. But we know that early experience is not the whole story, because if you look at, for example, genetic correlates of empathy, you do find some genes are associated with empathy scores. And we've recently been looking at hormones too. That you can look at the so-called male hormone testosterone, although both sexes have it, and actually individual differences in testosterone levels, both prenatally but also in terms of circulating testosterone, seem to be associated with how much empathy a person shows.
And what do we know about then the levels of things like testosterone and the genetic influence and environmental factors? How much of a role do each of them play?
Well, effectively, empathy is multifactorial. That each of these factors is playing a small part, and it would be wrong to try to attribute the variance in empathy to a single factor, because actually you can see all of these things interacting: genes, hormones, and experience.
And what about particular conditions that are associated with levels of empathy or a lack of empathy?
Well, in my talk tonight, I was focusing on some psychiatric conditions that can result in low empathy, and particularly the personality disorders. So psychopaths, or what's called antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, where people are very impulsive and often aggressive, in their style of relating to other people. And then this other one called narcissistic personality disorder, people who are really just very self-preoccupied and only think about themselves. And you can, although these are personality types, they are also examples of low empathy. And in my book I'm actually arguing that maybe we need a new category in psychiatry called empathy disorders.
And in cases like these, and also perhaps just regular members of the population that have mild levels of empathy, is it possible to teach empathy or increase this level?
Yeah, I sort of take the view that human beings are capable of change. So we're not sort of born with a fixed level of skills in any particular domain. That actually the more you practice at something, the better you get at it. And I think empathy is no different to other skills in that respect. But the more opportunity you get to practice, and the more exposure to things that could be useful. So some therapies, for example, foster empathy, and there are even new medical treatments that are being tried, which might affect empathy. And one that's got a lot of press recently is this hormone oxytocin, which nowadays comes in a nasal spray, and that if you have if you inhale oxytocin, it seems to change how well you score on an empathy test.
And so, is this then a potential use in the population?
It's being evaluated as a possible treatment for conditions where empathy is quite low, like autism, and people are also looking at it in relation to social anxiety. So disorders of, where people find it hard to trust other people.
And so this is one potential future step with regard to empathy, but with your particular work, what would you say your next area of research or your next steps will be?
Well, one of the puzzles is we know that empathy is compromised in a range of medical conditions. I mentioned the personality disorders, and also I mentioned autism. But part of the challenge is to try and understand why one person ends up with one diagnosis or one outcome, and another person ends up with a very different one, but even though the same empathy circuit seems to be affected. And one possibility is that because empathy is distributed across a number of different regions in the brain, it may be that combination of different brain regions, depending on whether certain brain regions are affected and not others, might lead to different outcomes. So that's part of what we want to test.